the human research vessel. Constellation drifted through the darkness of the Kepler system when the sensors picked up something strange, and Amy Sullivan ran her fingers across the scanning console while her heart began to pound faster, because this signal was not natural and it was not human either. And Captain Laura Bennett stood behind her with arms crossed, watching the data stream across the screens, and within minutes the bridge crew had located the source, and it was a damaged craft tumbling slowly through the void with its hull torn open in 3 places, and strange lights flickering weakly inside Amy, and her team suited up and crossed the void between ships, and when they entered the alien vessel through the largest breach, they found themselves in a world that seemed pulled from ancient Earth legends because the walls glowed with soft, bioluminescent patterns, and the architecture curved in ways that human engineering never attempted, and the air tasted sweet when they tested it and confirmed it was breathable, and then they found her in what appeared to be a command chamber. And she was dying. The alien woman lay on a crystalline platform that had once glowed but now stood dark and cold, and her skin had an ethereal quality that reminded Amy of the elves from old storybooks. But this was no fantasy, and the woman was very real and very much in danger of death, and her breathing came in shallow gasps, and beside her lay a creature that made Amy stop in her tracks, because it looked exactly like a dragon from human mythology with scales that shimmered in colors that shifted between blue and violet and wings folded against its body, and it too was dying. Kate Morrison knelt beside the poor alien woman and pulled out her medical scanner, and the readings made no sense because this being did not have blood like humans, but instead had some kind of energy flowing through channels in her body, and that energy was fading fast, and the dragon creature beside her had the same energy signature, and they were somehow connected. And when Kate touched the woman gently, the alien eyes opened, and they were the color of starlight, and filled with desperate hope. The woman spoke in a language that sounded like music and wind chimes, and the translation software struggled to make sense of it. But eventually words began to form on their helmet displays, and the message was simple and terrifying, and it said, "Help us, please, our people are dying and the machines are hunting us, and we have nowhere left to run," and Amy felt something twist in her chest, because she understood that desperation. They carried the alien woman and her dragon companion back to the constellation, and placed them in the medical bay where Kate worked frantically to understand their biology, and Captain Laura Bennett stood at the bedside with her command staff and tried to communicate, and slowly, piece by piece, they learned the truth about the being who called herself Lyrienne of the Ithari people. Lyrienne explained, through broken translation, that her species was ancient, far older than humanity, and they had developed technology based on bioenergy networks that connected their entire civilization, and the females of her species served as living conduits for this energy, and they were bonded from birth with companions that humans would call dragons, though the Ithari called them something that translated roughly as star kin, and together the bonded pairs maintained the energy networks that powered their worlds. But then the Dominion Collective had come, and they were a mechanical empire that consumed bioenergy species and turned their power into fuel for their endless expansion. And the war had lasted for decades, and the Ithari were losing badly because the Dominion had weapons that corrupted bioenergy at its source. And across dozens of worlds, the females were dying, and their dragon companions were fading with them. And Lyrienne had been fleeing from a battle when her ship was damaged, and she had drifted for weeks, slowly dying until the humans found her. Kate Morrison made a discovery that changed everything, and she was running tests on the quantum resonance generators that powered the constellation faster than light drives when she noticed something impossible, and the frequency signature of the generators matched almost perfectly with the bioenergy signature flowing through Lyrienne, and on a hunch, Kate brought Lyrienne closer to the engine core, and suddenly the alien woman gasped, and her skin began to glow with soft light, and color returned to her face, and beside her, the dragon. Vex lifted his head for the first time in days and made a sound like distant thunder. Amy Sullivan stared at the readings and understood what this meant. And human technology, completely by accident, produced exactly the kind of energy that the Ithari needed to survive. And it was not just compatible, it was perfect. And when she explained this to Captain Laura Bennett, the captain made a decision that would change the course of human history forever. The Constellation altered course and headed toward Ithari space, and they brought Lyrian and Vex with them, and along the way, Amy and her engineering team worked day and night to understand how they could adapt their technology to help more Ithari and Lyrian recovered quickly with access to the ship generators, and she began to teach the humans about her people and her culture and her war. Lyrian explained that she was a spear maiden, which meant she was both a warrior and a guardian of her people, and Vex was not just a companion, but a partner in battle, and when properly bonded through their energy cycle, they could channel devastating power, and she showed them recordings from her ship computer of battles where bonded pairs fought in the skies, breathing beams of pure energy that could cut through starship hulls, and Amy watched in awe and understood that humans had stumbled into something far larger than they had imagined. When the Constellation finally entered Ithari space and approached the homeworld of Ether Prime, the crew stood silent on the bridge because what they saw broke their hearts, and the planet below had once been covered in glowing networks of light connecting 7 great cities. But now most of those lights were dark, and only a few weak pulses remained, and Captain Laura Bennett ordered the ship into orbit and prepared to face whatever came next. They landed near the largest remaining city, and Lyrian led them through streets that were beautiful but empty, and they passed buildings that soared into the sky with architecture that seemed to grow rather than be built. And finally they reached a massive central structure that Lyrian called the Harmony Hall, and inside they found thousands of Ithari females lying in stasis pods and their dragon companions resting beside them, and all of them were dying. The Ithari who remained conscious greeted Lyrian with desperate joy, and they surrounded the human visitors with a mixture of hope and fear, and through Lyrian they explained that this was all that remained of their people in this sector, and across the galaxy, the story was the same, and the Dominion was winning, and soon there would be no Ithari left, and Amy Sullivan looked at Captain Laura Bennett and said, "We have to help them." And the captain nodded and said yes. Amy Sullivan stood in her makeshift laboratory surrounded by alien technology and human equipment, and she had not slept in 3 days, but she was close to a breakthrough, and beside her Lyrian watched with exhausted hope as Amy made adjustments to a portable quantum resonance generator, and the device hummed with power as Amy calibrated it to match Lyrian's exact energy signature. The problem was that each Ithari female had a unique energy pattern like a fingerprint, and the generators had to be tuned precisely or they would not work. And worse, they could actually harm the Ithari if the frequency was wrong, and Amy had spent days mapping Lyrian energy signature and using that as a template to develop a tuning protocol. And finally, after countless failures, she thought she had it. Amy activated the portable generator and handed it to Lyrian, and the alien woman held it against her chest and closed her eyes, and for a moment, nothing happened, and Amy's heart sank. But then Lyrian began to glow with soft light, and the glow grew brighter and stronger, and Vex, who had been resting in the corner, suddenly stood up and spread his wings and made a sound like joy. Lyrian opened her eyes, and they blazed with energy, and she looked at Amy with wonder and said, "It works. You have done it." And Amy felt tears running down her face because she had just saved a life, and maybe saved an entire species. And she immediately began making plans to scale up production, and within hours she had the entire Constellation engineering team working to build more portable generators. But there was a complication that Kate Morrison discovered, and she called Amy and Captain Laura Bennett to the medical bay to explain, and Kate showed them the data and said the generators work perfectly, but they require constant monitoring and adjustment because the Aetheri energy signatures fluctuate throughout their daily cycle, and if the generator frequency does not adjust with them, the Aetheri will become unstable, and Kate pulled up a graph showing how Lyrian energy had shifted over just 6 hours. This meant that each generator needed a human operator to monitor and adjust it in real time. And Amy did the math and realized they would need dozens of humans to care for the thousands of Aetheri in stasis. And the constellation only had a crew of 80, and Captain Laura Bennett made another decision. And she opened a channel to Earth and explained the situation and asked for volunteers. And within days, ships began arriving, carrying engineers and medical personnel who wanted to help. The humans called their solution the Harmony Protocol, and it was more than just technology, it was a partnership, and each human operator was paired with an Aetheri female, and they learned to read the subtle changes in energy signatures and adjust the generators accordingly and slowly. The stasis pods began to open, and the Aetheri females woke to find themselves alive, and their dragon companions woke with them. Lyrian took Amy to meet the other spear maidens as they recovered, and these were the elite warriors of the Aetheri, and each one was bonded to a dragon companion, and together they had fought the Dominion for years, and they gathered in the great hall of the city, and Amy stood before them feeling very small and very human. And Lyrian spoke to her sisters in their musical language, and then turned to Amy and translated. The Spear Maidens wanted to know if the human technology could restore them to full combat strength, because they had been fighting at reduced power for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. And Amy said she thought so, but they would need to test it carefully, and the warriors agreed, and the next day, Amy began working with a volunteer named Serial and her dragon companion, Keith. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, and with a properly tuned harmony generator, Serial energy levels did not just stabilize, they surged to levels higher than she had experienced in years, and when she bonded with Keth and channeled that energy, the dragon did not just breathe fire, he exhaled a beam of concentrated bioenergy that carved a trench 50 meters long in the practice field, and the other Spear Maidens watched with growing excitement. But while the humans worked to restore the Aetheri to fighting strength, Nina Hayes was uncovering something terrifying in the Aetheri data archives, and Nina was the Constellation Intelligence Officer, and she had been studying Dominion tactics and patterns, and what she found made her blood run cold, and she immediately called a meeting with Captain Laura Bennett, and Lyrian Nina explained that the Dominion was not just fighting a war, they were conducting a systematic extermination of all bioenergy species in this sector of the galaxy, and they had attacked dozens of different civilizations and harvested their energy to power their expansion. And the Aetheri, with their powerful networks, had been the primary target, but they were not the only victims, and Nina showed them a map of dead worlds stretching across hundreds of light years. Worse, Nina had detected a pattern in recent Dominion movements, and their scout ships were converging on Ether Prime, and they would arrive within days, and the Dominion would not send scouts unless they were preparing for a major assault, and Captain Laura Bennett looked at the map and understood that they were about to face their first real battle. The humans and Aetheri began preparing for war, and Amy Sullivan pushed her team to produce harmony generators faster, while the recovered Spear Maidens trained with their restored power, and Captain Laura Bennett worked with the Aetheri military commanders to plan a defense, and they had maybe 200 bonded pairs ready to fight, and the Constellation, plus 3 other human ships that had arrived with volunteers. And it would not be enough. Lyrian found Amy in the engineering bay late one night, and the alien warrior sat beside the exhausted human engineer and said, "We cannot win this battle if the Dominion sends a full fleet. We will be destroyed." And Amy said, "I know, but we have to try." And Lyrian touched Amy's hand gently and said, "You have already saved us. Even if we die tomorrow, you gave us hope again, and that is everything." The next morning, the sensors detected incoming ships, and they were Dominion vessels, and there were more than anyone had feared, and Captain Laura Bennett stood on the bridge and watched the enemy fleet enter orbit, and she counted 30 warships and twice that many harvester drones, and behind them came something massive that blotted out the stars, and Lyrian whispered, "That is a harvester flagship. It can drain a planet in hours." The battle for Ether Prime was about to begin. The Dominion fleet descended on Ether Prime like a dark wave, and their ships were angular and brutal compared to the organic curves of Etheri design, and they moved with mechanical precision, forming attack patterns that had destroyed 100 worlds before this one, and Captain Laura Bennett gave the order, and the Constellation and the other human ships moved to intercept, while below them the Spear Maidens took to the skies. Lyrian and Vex launched from the main city platform, and around them rose 200 bonded pairs, and their dragon's wings caught the light as they climbed toward the descending enemy, and Lyrian felt power flowing through her stronger than she had felt in years, and the harmony generator on her chest hummed in perfect tune with her energy cycle, and beside her, Vex roared with joy at being whole again. The first wave of Dominion drones swept down to harvest bioenergy from the city below, and the Spear Maidens met them head-on, and Lyrian and Vex dove into the swarm, and she channeled energy through their bond, and Vex opened his jaws and released a beam of pure concentrated power that cut through 3 drones before they even registered the attack, and around her the other bonded pairs did the same, and the sky filled with beams of light, and the drones began to fall. But the drones were just the beginning, and behind them came the Void Choir, and these were the Dominion most horrifying weapons. And they were energy beings that had been captured and corrupted and enslaved, and they looked like twisted versions of angels made of dark light, and they screamed as they attacked, and their screams could shatter bioenergy bonds. Amy Sullivan watched from the city command center as the battle unfolded above, and she saw the Void Choir appear, and she saw Spear Maidens falling from the sky as their bonds broke under the sonic assault, and she knew they needed something more. And she turned to her team and said, "We can overclock the generators, but it will require human operators to direct the energy flow manually." And Kate Morrison looked at her with horror and said, "That could kill you." And Amy said, "I know," but looked at the falling warriors and said, "We have to try." Within minutes, Amy and 5 other engineers were suiting up and climbing into small atmospheric craft, and each craft was equipped with an overclocked harmony generator, and Amy explained the plan over the comm and said, "We fly in formation with the bonded pairs, and we channel additional energy to them through our generators, and it will let them fight at levels beyond what they have ever achieved, but we have to stay in close proximity, and that means we will be in the middle of the battle." Helen Cruz was one of the human pilots, and she listened to Amy plan with a mixture of terror and excitement, and she had been flying shuttles for 10 years, but never in combat, and now she was about to dive into a space battle with dragons and aliens and mechanical horrors, and she thought, "This is insane," and then she thought, "This is exactly what I signed up for when I volunteered." The 6 human craft launched and climbed toward the battle, and Amy was in the lead ship, and she opened a channel to Lyrian and explained what they were going to try. And Lyrian understood immediately, and she called 6 other Spear Maidens to her, and they formed up with the human craft, and Amy activated her overclocked generator, and suddenly she could feel the energy flowing, not just through machines, but through living beings, and it was beautiful and terrifying. Lyrian felt the surge of power from Amy Craft, and it was like nothing she had ever experienced, and the energy flowing through her increased tenfold, and she bonded with Vex and channeled everything, and Vex released a beam so powerful it cut straight through a Dominion warship, and the explosion lit up the sky, and the other bonded pairs with human support did the same, and suddenly the tide of battle began to shift. Helen Cruz discovered that she could sense the energy patterns around her, and she guided her craft instinctively weaving between enemy fire while maintaining perfect formation with the spear maiden she was supporting, and a void choir entity dove toward her, screaming its corrupting song, and Helen felt fear, but she also felt the warmth of the Etheri warrior she was connected to through the generator, and that connection gave her strength, and she held her position, and the warrior destroyed the void choir with a precisely aimed energy beam. The battle raged for hours, and the Dominion kept sending more ships, but the combination of human technology and Etheri warriors was something they had never encountered before, and their tactical algorithms could not adapt fast enough, and Captain Laura Bennett coordinated the defense from the Constellation, firing the ship weapons to cover the bonded pairs below, and Nina Hayes analyzed enemy patterns and called out weak points in their formations. But then the Harvester flagship moved, and it had been hanging back observing the battle, and now it descended toward the planet's surface, and its massive hull bristled with draining pylons, and if it reached the ground it would begin harvesting and nothing could stop it. And Captain Laura Bennett made a desperate decision, and she ordered the Constellation to ram the flagship. Lyrian saw the human ship accelerate toward the massive harvester, and she understood what Laura Bennett was doing, and she screamed no over the comm. But the captain had already committed, and the Constellation shields flared as Dominion weapons pounded them, and the ship shuddered but kept accelerating. And then, at the last moment, Laura Bennett fired every weapon the ship had directly into the Harvester flagship at point-blank range. The explosion was visible from orbit, and both ships vanished in a sphere of white light, and Lyrian felt grief surge through her because these humans had saved her people, and now they had sacrificed themselves, and she channeled that grief into rage, and she and Vex tore through the remaining Dominion ships with fury. But then Amy's voice came over the comm, crackling with static, and she said the captain got everyone to escape pods before impact, and they are coming down now, and we need to protect them. And Lyrian's heart soared, and she rallied the spear maidens, and they formed a defensive screen over the descending escape pods and fought off the last Dominion drones until finally the enemy retreated. The battle was over and Ether Prime was saved, but at terrible cost, and the Constellation was destroyed along with 2 other human ships, and hundreds of Etheri warriors had fallen. And as Lyrian landed in the city plaza, she saw Amy craft touch down nearby, and the human engineer climbed out exhausted and covered in sweat, and Lyrian ran to her and embraced her and said, "You fought like one of us," and Amy said, "We are one of you." Now Captain Laura Bennett emerged from her escape pod, bruised but alive, and she gathered her surviving crew and looked up at the scarred sky and said, "This is just the beginning, and the Dominion will come again, and we need to be ready." And Lyrian stood beside her and said, "Next time, we will be." And together, they walked into the city to plan for the next battle. But Nina Hayes had made a discovery during the battle, and she had intercepted Dominion communications and decoded part of their battle chatter, and what she learned made her run to find Captain Laura Bennett. And when she told the captain what she had discovered, Laura Bennett's face went pale because the attack on Ether Prime had been a distraction, and the real Dominion target was something called the Grand Nexus, and if the enemy captured it, the war was already over. The Grand Nexus stood on the moon of Tharas, and it was older than the Etheri civilization itself, and Lyrian explained to the humans that her ancestors had found it there already, ancient when they first achieved spaceflight, and the Nexus was a massive crystalline structure that contained the genetic and energy records of every bioenergy species the Etheri had ever encountered. And it was not just a database, it was something more, something alive in ways even the Etheri did not fully understand. Nina Hayes pulled up the intercepted Dominion communications and showed them to the command staff, and the enemy was sending their entire regional armada to Tharas, and they would arrive within 2 days, and if the Dominion captured the Nexus, they would have the information needed to hunt down every remaining bioenergy civilization in the galaxy, and it would be the end of not just the Etheri, but dozens of other species. Captain Laura Bennett had lost her ship, but not her command, and she stood in the Etheri council chamber surrounded by military leaders from both species, and she said, "We have to get there first and hold the Nexus until reinforcements arrive, and a human fleet is on the way, but it will take weeks, and we have days," and the Ethari commanders looked at each other with doubt because they knew the numbers and the Dominion would have overwhelming force. But Amy Sullivan had an idea, and she said, "What if we do not try to hold the Nexus from the outside? What if we go inside and activate its defenses?" And Lyrian said, "No one has been able to activate those systems for thousands of years. We do not know how they work." And Amy said, "Then maybe it is time we learned, because we have something your ancestors did not have." And she held up a harmony generator and said, "We have this." They assembled a strike team, and Lyrian insisted on leading it, and she chose 20 of her best spear maidens, and Amy volunteered along with 6 other human engineers, and Kate Morrison came because they might need medical support, and a squad of human Marines joined them, led by a tough woman named Beth Palmer, who had fought in 3 colonial wars and knew how to handle desperate situations. They took what was left of the human fleet and flew toward Tharis, and it was a ragtag collection of damaged ships and civilian transports converted to carry troops, and they arrived at the moon just hours before the Dominion Armada. And they could see the enemy ships on sensors already approaching, and Captain Laura Bennett looked at the tactical display and said, "We cannot win a space battle against those numbers, so we have to make sure the space battle does not matter." The strike team landed near the Nexus entrance, and the structure rose before them like a mountain of crystal, and it pulsed with faint light like a heartbeat, and Lyrian led them inside, and the corridors were vast and beautiful and covered in writing that even the Ethari could no longer read, and Amy ran her scanners over the walls and said, "This is not writing. It is circuitry. The entire structure is one massive machine." They descended deeper into the Nexus, following energy signatures that Amy scanners detected, and behind them they could hear the sounds of the Dominion arriving, and the enemy had landed troops and sent harvester drones into the Nexus, and the drones could track bioenergy, which meant they could hunt the strike team through the maze of corridors, and Beth Palmer set up defensive positions at key choke points and prepared to slow the enemy down. The Dominion drones caught up to them in a vast chamber deep in the Nexus, and the battle was brutal and close quarters, and the drones could drain bioenergy on contact, which meant the Spear Maidens had to fight at reduced power, and Lyrian discovered that the drones adapted quickly, and they learned from each encounter and became harder to kill, and the strike team was being pushed back. But then Beth Palmer realized something, and she said to her Marines, "The drones are ignoring us and they are focusing on the Etheri," and Amy understood and said, "It is because we do not have bioenergy. They do not see us as threats." And Beth grinned and said, "Then let us surprise them," and the human Marines charged forward with kinetic weapons, and the drones had no defense against old-fashioned bullets and explosives. They fought their way deeper and lost 3 Marines and 2 Spear Maidens, and Kate Morrison worked frantically to stabilize the injured while the team kept moving, and finally they reached the core of the Nexus, and it was a chamber so vast they could not see the ceiling, and in the center floated a sphere of light that pulsed with ancient power, and Amy felt something calling to her from that sphere. Lyrian stepped forward and placed her hand on the sphere, and she tried to activate it using traditional Ethari energy techniques, but nothing happened, and she tried again channeling more power, and still nothing, and frustration filled her because they were running out of time and the Dominion was getting closer, and behind them they could hear weapons fire as Beth Palmer team fought a desperate rear guard action. Amy Sullivan approached the sphere, and she pulled out her harmony generator and activated it and held it close to the surface of the sphere, and suddenly the entire chamber lit up with blinding light, and Amy felt something reach into her mind, and she heard voices, thousands of them, all speaking at once, and they were the voices of extinct civilizations, and they were asking her who she was and why she had come. Amy spoke aloud and said, "We need your help. The Dominion is trying to destroy us." And the voices replied, "We have seen the Dominion. They are not new. They have come before wearing different names, and we were built to stop them." And Amy said, "Then help us stop them now." And the voices said, "There is a price to awaken us fully. We need a bridge between the old ways and the new, and you must become that bridge." Lyrian realized what the Nexus was asking, and she grabbed Amy and said, "No, you do not understand what this means. You will be changed forever." And Amy looked at her friend and said, "I understand, and I choose this." And before Lyrian could stop her, Amy pressed the Harmony generator directly into the sphere, and the light swallowed her. Amy's consciousness exploded outward, and suddenly she could feel everything, and she was connected to the entire Nexus, and through it she could sense every bioenergy signature within 1,000 light years. And she could feel the Dominion ships approaching, and she could feel the corrupted energy beings they had enslaved, and she understood now what the Nexus truly was. And it was a weapon, but also a guardian, and it had been sleeping for millennia, waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between technology and biology. In orbit around Tharis, the Dominion Armada arrived, and they sent their most powerful weapon forward, and it was the Eclipse engine, and it was designed to drain entire planets and store that energy for the Dominion to use, and the massive ship positioned itself over the moon and extended its harvesting pylons and began to draw power from the Nexus. But the Nexus was no longer sleeping, and Amy was no longer just human. And together they reached back through the harvesting pylons and into the Eclipse engine, and they found the enslaved energy beings that powered the ship, and Amy spoke to them in a language beyond words and said, "You do not have to serve them anymore." And the beings understood, and they broke their chains. The Eclipse engine tore itself apart from within, and the explosion took out 3 other Dominion ships. And across the Armada, the enslaved Void Choir entities turned on their masters, and suddenly the Dominion fleet was fighting itself, and Captain Laura Bennett watched from her command position and whispered, "What is happening?" And Lyrian, who was still in the Nexus core chamber watching Amy glowing form, said, "Amy is happening." The battle ended not with defeat, but with liberation, and the Dominion ships that survived fled, and the Grand Nexus broadcasted a signal across the galaxy, and everywhere the Dominion had enslaved bioenergy beings. Those beings heard the signal and broke free, and the Mechanical Empire sudden found itself fighting a war on 1,000 fronts. But when Lyrian tried to reach Amy, she found that her friend was no longer entirely present, and Amy's consciousness was spread across the Nexus network, and she was alive but changed, and Lyrian held what remained of Amy's physical form and wept, because this was not the victory she wanted. 3 months after the Battle of Tharis, the galaxy was changing, and the signal from the Grand Nexus had awakened bioenergy civilizations across dozens of sectors and species that had been hiding in fear now emerged and reached out to each other, and at the center of it all was the Nexus, and at the heart of the Nexus was Amy Sullivan, who was no longer quite human, but not quite anything else. Either Lyrian visited Amy every day, and she would sit in the core chamber and talk to the glowing sphere that held her friend consciousness, and sometimes Amy would answer, and her voice would come from the walls themselves, warm and familiar, but also distant, like an echo from far away. And they would talk about the war, and about the future, and about what it meant to sacrifice yourself for others. The Athari civilization was rebuilding, and human engineers worked alongside Athari biocrafters, creating a hybrid technology that was stronger than either species could achieve alone. And the Harmony generators had evolved, and they were now integrated directly into Athari architecture. And every city on every Athari world hummed with the combined energy of 2 very different peoples. Working as one, Captain Laura Bennett received a new ship from Earth, and it was called the Constellation II, and it was the first vessel designed from the start to carry both human and Athari crew, and the ship had quantum resonance generators integrated into every system, and it could support bonded pairs who could launch from flight decks designed specifically for dragons. And when Laura Bennett took command, she stood on a bridge where humans and Athari worked side by side, and she thought, "This is what the future looks like." Helen Cruz became the first human pilot certified to fly in formation with Spear Maidens, and she bonded professionally with a warrior named Kessa, and together they developed new combat tactics that combined human precision with Ithari intuition, and they trained other human pilots, and soon there were squadrons of mixed human Ithari units patrolling the borders of liberated space. Kate Morrison made a discovery in her ongoing research, and she found that long-term exposure to harmony generators was changing human biology in subtle ways, and humans who worked closely with the Ithari were beginning to develop the ability to sense bioenergy naturally, and it was not strong enough to make them like the Ithari, but it was enough to create a real connection. And Kate published her findings, and the response from both species was joy, because it meant the bond between them was not just technological, it was becoming biological. Nina Hayes tracked Dominion movements, and what she saw gave her hope, and the mechanical empire was in retreat, and their harvesting operations were failing, because everywhere they went, they found bioenergy civilizations that fought back, and the Dominion had built their power on enslaving others, and now those slaves were free, and the empire was crumbling under its own weight. But the Dominion was not defeated, and they regrouped in the outer reaches of known space, and they began developing new weapons and new strategies. And Nina knew that the war was not over. It was just entering a new phase. And she reported this to Captain Laura Bennett and said we need to take the fight to them before they recover. And Laura Bennett agreed. Lyrian stood before the Council of Spear Maidens and proposed something that had never been done before, and she said we should take our warriors into Dominion space and liberate the worlds they have conquered and free the beings they have enslaved and become not just defenders, but liberators. And the other warriors agreed, and they began to prepare for the longest campaign in Ithari history. The new offensive launched 6 months after the Battle of Tharis, and it was a fleet unlike any the galaxy had seen. And there were Ithari warships flying alongside human vessels and bonded pairs launching from carriers, while human pilots flew escort and dozens of other liberated species joined them, and they carried harmony generators modified to work with different bioenergy signatures, and they brought hope to dying worlds. Amy Sullivan watched through the eyes of the Nexus, and her consciousness stretched across light years, and she could see the fleet advancing, and she could feel every bioenergy being they freed, and it filled her with something beyond joy, because she was no longer capable of simple emotions, but she understood that what she had become was necessary, and she was the bridge not just between humans and Ithari, but between all the scattered peoples of the galaxy. Lyrian led the Spear Maidens into battle after battle, and Vex fought beside her, and they were unstoppable. And worlds that had been dark for decades began to glow again with restored bioenergy networks, and everywhere they went, they left behind harmony generators and human engineers to teach the locals how to maintain them, and the liberations spread like wildfire. 2 years after first contact between humans and Ithari, the war reached a turning point, and the Dominion attempted one final massive assault, and they gathered every ship they had left and attacked the Grand Nexus, directly thinking that if they destroyed the source of the signal, they could break the alliance, and Amy felt them coming, and she reached out through the Nexus and called for help. Ships came from 100 worlds, and humans and Ithari fought side by side with species that had been enemies just years before, and the battle raged for 3 days, and the Dominion threw everything they had at the defenders, but it was not enough, and the mechanical empire finally broke, and their ships fled into deep space, and the war was over. In the aftermath, Amy Sullivan made a choice, and she had been part of the Nexus for so long that returning to a single human body seemed impossible. But she discovered she could create avatars and project her consciousness into them, and the first time she walked in physical form again, Lyrian was there, and they embraced, and Lyrian said, "Welcome back," and Amy said, "I never really left." The galaxy settled into an uneasy peace, and the Dominion still existed somewhere in the darkness beyond known space, but they were no longer hunting, and they were being hunted, and the alliance of bioenergy civilizations grew stronger every day, and at its heart was the partnership between humans and Athari, and two peoples who should never have met, but who had found each other at exactly the right moment. Captain Laura Bennett stood on the bridge of the Constellation 2 and looked at the stars, and beside her stood Lyrian, and behind them, the bridge crew worked efficiently, humans and Ethari, moving in perfect synchronization. And Laura Bennett said it started with one desperate encounter in empty space, and Lyrian said, and it changed the galaxy. And Laura Bennett smiled and said, no, it changed us, and that changed the galaxy. Amy. Sullivan existed in the Nexus and in 100 avatars across known space, and she was the living bridge between technology and biology, and she watched over the Alliance and guided its growth, and sometimes late at night, in the quiet moments, she wondered if she was still human, and then she would feel Lyrian presence through their connection, and she would remember that humanity was not about biology. It was about choice and compassion, and the willingness to help others, even when it cost everything. The story of how humans saved the Athari spread across the galaxy, and it became a legend, but it was not the end. It was a beginning, and new species joined the Alliance every year, and human harmony technology evolved and integrated with dozens of different bioenergy systems, and the galaxy was no longer a dark place full of hunters and prey. It was becoming something better. Lyrian and Vex took to the stars, and they led the Spear Maidens on missions of liberation and exploration, and everywhere they went they carried a harmony generator designed by Amy Sullivan, and they brought hope to worlds that had forgotten what hope felt like, and they proved that the strongest bonds were not forged in similarity, but in the courage to bridge the gap between different forms of life. And far away in the darkness, the Dominion watched and waited and rebuilt and planned, because mechanical empires do not surrender. They adapt. But now they faced an enemy that was also adapting and learning and growing, and the next time they met, the galaxy would be ready. The war had taught both humans and Ethari that survival required more than strength. It required connection and understanding and the willingness to sacrifice for others. And these lessons spread through the Alliance and created something that had never existed before. And it was not perfect. And there were conflicts and misunderstandings, but there was also hope. In the end, the story of Amy Sullivan and Lyrian and all the humans and Athari who fought together became more than history. It became the foundation of a new civilization, and one that celebrated difference instead of fearing it, and one that proved that the youngest species in the galaxy could teach the oldest new ways to live. The Grand Nexus pulsed with light, and Amy consciousness flowed through it. And she thought about that first moment when she found Lyrian dying in a damaged ship, and she thought about all the choices that followed, and she thought about the price she paid, and she decided it was worth it because she had helped create something beautiful, and she had helped bridge the gap between worlds, and that was enough. Somewhere in the depths of space, new civilizations were waking up and hearing the signal from the Nexus, and they were reaching out and asking for help, and the Alliance was answering, and the cycle continued, and the galaxy grew brighter, one world at a time, and at the heart of it all was a simple truth that a human engineer and an alien warrior had discovered together, that the strongest power in the universe was not energy or technology or weapons, but the willingness to reach across the darkness and say, I will help you, and together we will find a way forward into the light.